Hello everyone, welcome wherever you are across Australia to today's launch of the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre and the Workplace Gender Equality Agency's Gender Equity Insights 2023 Accelerating the Pace of Change report. My name is Madeleine. I'm very pleased to be hosting today's event for you. I am the finance presenter of ABC News Breakfast. So Breakfast TV, yes, I have been awake since 3 o'clock in the morning, in case you were asking. It is so important, the work of WGEA. Every day, it seems almost, I and journalists like myself are reporting on the really difficult cost of living situation that we're going through at the moment. Just this morning, we had a new report about the terrible rental crisis in Australia at the moment. Rents have gone up 30% in the last 3 years, and we know who is most affected by homelessness and these rental crises at the moment. It is women over the age of 55. They are the highest, the fastest growing demographic for homeless people or people experiencing homelessness in Australia. So women pay the price for the economic and financial circumstances that happen to them during their working lives. That is why the work of WGEA is so important. That's why the work that you do as attendees here at this launch today is so important. So it's great to have your company. It'll be a very interesting report, a great discussion to follow. So let's kick off by introducing Emeritus Professor Simon Forrest, Whadjuk Noongar Elder and Curtin University Fellow, who will now deliver the Welcome to Country.
Kaya Wanju. Hello and welcome. My name is Simon Forrest Burungu. I'm a Whadjuk Baladong Noongar with kin connections to Yamaji and Wongai peoples. I am of this land and place. I follow a bloodline of people who have walked and cared for this land for over 40,000 years. This is a welcome to country, a welcome to Whadjuk Noongar Buja. A welcome to country recognises and acknowledges us and the first and continuing custodians of this land, Australia. Nidja Bolo, Nidja Kunkungap, Nidja Margarap, Nidja Mindarap. Kaya Wanju, Nan Kwel, Simon Forrest Burungu. Kaya Wanju, Nidja Whadjuk Noongar Buja. Nal Karich Noongar Mod. Ken Karat Nidja Buja. Nan Karich Noongar Kabali Morankoriye.
Thank you very much, Simon Forrest, and I would like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people here in Melbourne today. If you have just joined us, a very warm welcome to the BCEC WGEA Gender Equity Insights 2023 National Online Report launch. Today's a really significant occasion. It's the 8th year of the partnership between the BCEC and WGEA, and it's really established a powerful evidence base on the actions that businesses and governments can take to improve gender equality in Australia, and this new report is absolutely no exception. For the first time, this year's report breaks down which types of companies are progressing gender equity outcomes most effectively and which are falling behind. It's also providing a practical roadmap to support businesses seeking faster progress towards gender equity. We've got a very full program for you today. We're featuring a presentation of the new research findings by BCEC, remarks from WGEA CEO Mary Wooldridge, and then we will have a panel discussion with an audience Q&A. And this is where you, will have your opportunity to have your questions answered by our expert panel. I'll get into how you can do that in just a moment. But first of all, let's begin proceedings. We're going to have some opening remarks from Jodene Murphy, who's the General Manager of Customer Marketing and Communications, Bankwest. Then we will be followed by the presentation of the research findings of Professor Alan Duncan, who is Director and Associate Professor Aztec Magisakalian, who's Principal Research Fellow both at the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre. Then Mary Woolridge, CEO of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, will speak. And for our panel and Q&A with you, we have Lisa Samuels, who's the Chief Experience Officer of HESTA, and Karen Lonergan, who's Chief People and Stakeholder Engagement Officer at Stockland, and Mary and Alan will join them. Right, so I'm sure that you, at the end of the presentations, will have heaps of burning questions. Please do let us know what they are. At any point, you can put them during the stream. So send your questions for the panel Q&A using the dedicated Q&A box on your device. Just look for the little question mark box on your device. You can put your name if you want to. You don't have to. You can be anonymous by ticking the anonymous box if you'd like. And if there's a specific panel member who you'd like to put your question to, just let us know. Question for Alan, question for Mary, etc., and then type your question. Now, if you can multitask and you can tweet or X or whatever we're calling it these days with today's events, make sure you use the hashtag. That's hashtag gender equality and tag BCEC via @Bankwest Curtin and Wajir. That is at WGE Agency. All right, let's get into the main event. To start, please welcome Jodene Murphy, who is General Manager of Customer Marketing and Communications at Bankwest, for her introductory remarks. Welcome, Jodene.
Thank you, Madeleine. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I come to you today, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And with today's event being accessible across Australia, I extend that respect to all First Nations peoples and their enduring connection to land, sea and community. I'd like to welcome you to the 8th instalment of the Gender Equity Insights Report, an important collaborative effort between the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre and the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. My name's Jodene Murphy. I'm the General Manager of Customer Marketing and Communications at Bankwest. It's a real pleasure to be here today for such an interesting topic. Bankwest has been part of the fabric of Western Australia for 128 years. Our goal is to be the simple, easy bank for homeowners of today and tomorrow nationwide. And to make that a reality, we're focusing investment in meeting fast-growing customer preferences for world-class digital and broker services across Australia. Our partnership with Curtin University to support the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre is another critical area of investment for us, and it's a central pillar in our continued commitment to the communities in which we live and work. Last year, the Centre entered its second decade of producing critical social and economic insights that inform and shape debate on key issues impacting WA and the nation. And during this time, it's grown to become a highly respected and nation-leading economic research centre. Among the invaluable reports produced by the Centre is the annual collaborative effort with the Wajir on Gender Equity Insights. The BCEC and Wajir Gender Equity Insights series has highlighted the significant progress being made on the path to gender equality, whilst also shining a light on the insufficient speed of change. And this year, for the first time, the report provides insights into which types of companies are progressing gender equity outcomes most effectively and which are falling behind. This is an important addition and complements the report's objective to foster debate and action with evidence-based insights that can help sectors and employers shift from stagnation to success. I want to congratulate and thank Professor Alan Duncan and the BCEC team, as well as CEO Mary Woolridge and her colleagues at the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, for coming together to produce such an invaluable report. I have absolutely no doubt that by the end of today's session, we'll be equipped with some powerful insights and strategies on how to effect genuine change in the workplace as we strive for gender equality across Australia. Thank you, and I can't wait to hear the insights. Back to you, Madeleine.
Thanks very much for that, Jodene. All right, without further ado, let's get into the meat of it. I'd like to introduce Professor Alan Duncan, who is Director of the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, and report co-author Associate Professor Astrid Mavisakalyan, who is Principal Research Fellow at the Centre, to give you the presentation of all their hard work into today's research findings. Over to you, Alan and Astrid.
Thanks so much, Madeleine, and can I also thank you all for joining us from across the country for today's launch. As Madeleine mentioned, Astrid and I are going to share the presentation of the main findings from this latest report in the Gender Equity Insights series, Accelerating the Pace of Change. But before we do, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on across the country and pay our respects to elders and senior knowledge holders, past, present and emerging. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and I also acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional custodians of the lands on which the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre is located. And thanks also to Mary Wooldridge and her team at the Workplace Gender Equality Agency for the privilege of our partnership. So, as mentioned, this report is the 8th to come from our partnership with the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. And we draw insights from WGEA's world-leading reporting data on the progress of women's economic equality in the workplace. Gender equality, and particularly promoting women's economic opportunities through employment, are being prioritised in policy discussions at both state and federal level, not least through the recent Employment White Paper and the recommendations from the Women's Economic Equality Task Force. And we've seen gradual improvement within Australian businesses on pay metrics and in the shares of women in the workforce and in leadership positions, but at a very gradual rate. And we also see big differences between the best and worst performing businesses when it comes to gender equity in the workplace. And so this report focuses on what businesses need to do to accelerate the pace of change in delivering better gender equity outcomes for their employees. Now, we often look at pay inequality in terms of median or average gender pay gaps within a business or across an industry sector, but pay opportunities are actually quite variable. And one aspect of gender pay inequality that tends to be overlooked is the unequal access to higher earnings, even within a particular profession or occupation class. So in this report, alongside the median gender pay gap or the average pay gap, we compare the pay of, say, the top 10% of women and the top 10% of men at the same age within the same occupation class, or the bottom 10% of women versus the bottom 10% of men. For example, gender pay gaps for full-time managers, in green on the left here, range from around 19.4% on average for the lowest 10% of earners to 21.8% for the top 10th of earners. So gender pay gaps for full-time managers are similar over the entire range of earnings. But the same can't be said for part-time managers, even after we control for gender differences in occupational classes between women and men. The lowest 10% of part-time female managers earn 4.2% more than their male counterparts, in purple on the left chart here. Gender pay gaps progressively rise, with earnings among part-time managers reaching 34.7% for the highest paid workers. And that's something we need to be aware of, the glass ceiling within an occupational class. Ashti.
Thanks, Alan. The gender workforce concentrations play a key role in perpetuating disparities in pay and progression. The report uncovers significant changes in workforce gender concentration across industries. As this table shows, the share of female managers increased by 1.7 percentage points, reaching 42.4% over 3 years. Businesses in mining and construction, agriculture and manufacturing traditionally employ fewer female managers. Encouragingly, the average shares of women in these industries have gone up. There has been a remarkable progress in public administration, where the share of female managers increased by 5.6 percentage points. Male-dominated businesses have witnessed the most significant changes in the gender balance of managerial workforce. Across businesses with under 20% female managers, the overall share of female managers increased by over 4 percentage points. Some industry sectors have been particularly successful in driving gender balance. For instance, businesses in the administrative services with under 20% female managers, so the share of women increased by 17.5 percentage points in 3 years. Other sectors like financial and insurance services, accommodation and food, and education and training experienced increases of over 10 percentage points in the share of female managers. We are seeing an increase in the share of businesses achieving a 40-40-20 balance in managerial workforce. For instance, businesses in the retail, hiring, and real estate services saw a rise of 10 percentage points in the share of 40-40-20 businesses. The pace of change in gender workforce concentration among non-managers is slower when compared to their managerial counterparts. The workplaces appear evenly balanced between men and women at this level, but this conceals differences in gender balance across various non-managerial occupations. For instance, over 80% of technicians and trade workers are men, while nearly 3/4 of those in administrative services are women. Despite this, gender balance in the non-managerial workforce has improved to a greater extent within male-dominated businesses. The share of female non-managers increased by 2.5 percentage points over 3 years among businesses where less than 20% of managers were women. Furthermore, the overall share of businesses achieving a 40-40-20 gender balance in non-managerial employees increased by 1.5 percentage points over the same period. Remarkable progress has been made in certain sectors such as arts and recreation and administrative and transport services. But more needs to be done to break down the gender stereotypes, entry barriers, and biases associated with specific occupations and industries. Making progress towards a more balanced workforce can go a long way towards narrowing the gender pay gap that persists in many industries. As the lower right part of this figure suggests, for businesses in most industry sectors, the rising shares of women in the managerial workforce have gone hand in hand with reductions in managerial gender pay gaps. The exceptions to this rule are for businesses in the retail trades, accommodation and food services, and education and training sectors, as we see on the upper right part of this figure. To capture the pace of change in gender pay gaps, we looked at the average pay gaps for businesses reporting to WGEA in 2 periods. This chart shows that businesses in sectors with the highest 2019 gender pay gaps also show the greatest improvements in the managerial gender pay gaps over the 3 years. For instance, businesses in art and recreation reduced the average managerial pay gap from 20.1% to 14.3%. Similar trends are seen in sectors with the highest gender pay gaps for managers in 2019. However, these patterns of change in average gender pay gaps for managers are not mirrored in the non-managerial workforce. We see slower change for most industry sectors, with some sectors even experiencing reversals of trends observed for managers. For instance, the gender pay gap for non-managers in the construction sector increased by 1.3 percentage points. While we must continue to champion gender equity for managers within organizations, we should not lose sight of the equally important task of driving improved gender equity outcomes among non-managerial occupations. The representation of women on boards has improved over the past 3 years. For example, the share of women on boards increased by 1.9 percentage points to 28% by 2022. The share of female board chairs also increased, with 16.7% of boards chaired by women in 2022. There is a strong positive association between women's board representation and the overall gender workforce concentration within a business. The greater the share of female employees, the greater the representation of women on boards. But despite these improvements, it is evident that the representation of women on boards still falls short of the overall gender balance in the workforce. For businesses with a 40-40-20 gender balance of women and men in the workforce, the share of female board members has reached only 27.2%. Gender diversity in decision-making and boardrooms is a key driver of organizational change. While we have seen progress in the past 3 years, the current rate of change will leave women underrepresented in the boardroom for decades to come. Back to Alan.
Thanks, Ashley. Now, using data reported to WGEA in 2019 and 2022, our report shows that the best performing Australian companies have delivered an average 5.3 percentage point drop in their gender pay gap in 3 years. But our research also exposes a deep divide within industry sectors between the best performing businesses, those that are making progress to close gender pay gaps, and the worst performers. Mining, manufacturing, retail trade, as well as professional, scientific and technical services sectors are amongst the industry sectors where this difference is most pronounced. But businesses that undertake a pay gap audit do substantially better when it comes to lowering gender pay gaps, something that we found consistently over a number of our previous reports in this series. So our report compares the policies and actions of companies that are advanced in their approach to gender equality against those that are early in their journey to develop a new roadmap to inform employer action. The analysis benchmarks the performance of organisations to 4 levels of maturity based on their approach to gender pay equity strategies and gender policies and actions. The 4 maturity levels comprise a base level with limited action on workplace gender equality beyond statutory or mandated practices, a foundational level for businesses that implement some workplace gender equality policies beyond mandated requirements, a growth level for more ambitious formal commitments towards progress, and an integrated level reserved for businesses with an embedded and comprehensive suite of gender equality practices across all areas of the organisation. To do so, we bring together a broad set of specific actions for each of the 3 domains related to pay equity strategies, recruitment, retention, and other policies and actions around driving progress, such as parental leave, flexible work, family and caregiving, and sex-based harassment policies. For example, these are our ratings for specific pay equity policies and actions. The data indicate that most businesses in Australia are currently operating at a base or foundational level of gender equity practice, 34% and 35% respectively. Around 18% of businesses are implementing growth practice, while 13% have progressed towards the integrated level. But digging deeper into different domains, we find far fewer Australian businesses, only around 15%, to be at the growth or integrated level in their approach to pay gap strategies. Now, this aligns with the relatively low shares of businesses that undertake specific pay equity actions and affirms the importance of the recent legislative changes that will mandate reporting of pay metrics to executives and boards. Businesses are most likely to situate at either the foundational or the growth level for policies and actions related to parental leave, family policies, and measures to support people experiencing sex-based harassment or domestic violence. The domain of recruitment, retention, and flexible work is the most advanced, with around 40% of businesses operating at the integrated level. A great deal of variation across industry sector, with a greater level of maturity in approach to gender equity policies amongst businesses in the professional, scientific, and technical services sector, in finance and insurance, and in IT and telecommunications. But the question is, does maturity matter when it comes to delivering better gender equity outcomes? Ashton.
Thanks, Alan. The report examines the link between the maturity of approach of a business toward gender equity and changes in a range of gender equality outcomes. And we find that the link is strong. Businesses with an integrated approach to gender equity increased the share of female full-time managers by 3.3 percentage points over 3 years. This is 3 times the rate of progress of businesses that are still early in their journey. The same is true when we look at the general workforce, with integrated businesses increasing the share of female employees by 0.9 percentage points. There was no significant change for base organizations. And businesses that have an integrated approach to gender equity reduced their gender pay gaps by 1.6 percentage points in 3 years. For organizations at the base level of maturity, the gender pay gap remained more or less unchanged. Businesses with an integrated approach to gender equity were also far more effective in lifting women's representation on governing boards. Our analysis shows that integrated businesses increased the share of female board chairs and board members by 6.8 and 5.5 percentage points respectively. Base organizations saw far lower increases over the same period. We also found that the share of resignations among female managers increased by 2.6 percentage points in 3 years among businesses at the base maturity level. However, it actually reduced by 0.3 percentage points among organizations at the highest level of maturity. So actions do work. Our analysis shows conclusively that businesses with a more integrated approach to gender-related policies and actions have an accelerated pace of change on gender equality outcomes within their organizations. We also look at improvements in gender equality indicators among businesses that have improved the maturity of their approach to gender equity. We do so by applying consistent methods to assess the level of maturity of the same businesses at two different points in time. This table shows maturity levels in 2019 and 2022 among businesses surveyed in both periods. Around 42% of businesses were adopting best practices in 2019, with 31% rated at the foundational level of maturity. By 2022, the share of businesses rated at the base level fell to 33%, with most moving to the foundational level of maturity over the 3 years. In fact, around 28% of businesses improved their approach to workplace gender equality by at least one level of maturity between 2019 and 2022, with 55% remaining at the same level. We use this variation to compare changes in gender equality outcomes between businesses that improved their levels of maturity and those that remained at the same or worse level. We find that an increase in maturity levels is positively linked to enhanced gender equity outcomes. For example, the share of female employees increased by 0.8 percentage points and female managers by 2.1 percentage points among businesses that improved their maturity level, on the left here. In both cases, that's far greater than the increases for businesses that remained at the same or lower maturity. The chart on the right shows that businesses that advanced their maturity also had a greater pace of change in women's representation on boards. This gives us confidence that the maturity framework developed in this report is supported by strong evidence about what works to accelerate the pace of change. Alan.
So, what policies and actions should Australian businesses consider when seeking to accelerate the pace of change and to improve women's economic outcomes in the workplace? This latest Gender Equity Insights report offers an evidence-informed roadmap for Australian organisations to progress towards improved gender equity outcomes. Our maturity framework allows us to identify policies that have been implemented by businesses that outperform their sector on gender equality benchmarks. To identify differences in approach, we compare the relative prevalence of policies and actions for businesses that perform in the top 25% of their industries on 3 metrics: on the rate of reduction in gender pay gaps, on the rate of improvement in workforce gender balance, and in growth in the share of women on governing boards. And we find there to be some quite pronounced sectoral differences in policy implementation. For example, the most advanced businesses in the mining sector are 4 times more likely to set a pay equity action plan and 7 times more likely to set targets to reduce gender pay gaps compared to businesses that are earlier on in their journeys towards workplace gender equity. And so, findings from this report: what should businesses do to promote better gender equity outcomes for women in the workforce, and what works to accelerate change? When we see organisations undertaking pay equity audits and analysing their remuneration with a gender lens, we see a greater pace of change. The best performing businesses also have enhanced parental leave provisions for secondary as well as primary carers, as well as the reporting, training and accountability for flexible work. Analysing remuneration processes for gender bias is crucial, and not just for base pay, but for the full spectrum of discretionary awards, commencement salaries and performance-related pay. Businesses tend to outperform the sector when they put in place tangible pay equity action plans. And accountability also matters. And this is something that we found in previous reports in the series. It's not just a matter of analysing data. There needs to be an accountability and ownership of gender equity as an objective. And this often manifests itself through reporting of gender equality outcomes to executive leadership and governing boards. And this is why the recent legislative changes to the Workplace Gender Equality Act 2012 that will require businesses to report gender equality metrics to their executives and governing boards are so welcome as an agent of accelerated change. Women are demonstrably not accessing the top rates of pay compared to men, even within a given industry and occupation class, and even within the same age cohort. And that's something that we need to be aware of, this glass ceiling within occupational classes. This is why businesses need to make sure that the process for remuneration, performance ratings, and performance-related pay are insulated from any form of gender bias, because a lot of the discrepancy tends to come from an unequal access to discretionary pay between women and men. And I think the last call to action is to break down the gender stereotypes or the entry barriers or the attitudinal biases that tend to hinder women's aspirations for careers in specific occupations or for specific industries. Now, this is a shared responsibility between governments, communities, schools, and families, but businesses are an integral part of the solution and have an important role to play in creating a positive and a supportive workplace environment. This is why work design settings around flexible work, family policies, and support for people experiencing domestic violence is so important. We find that the best performing companies take seriously the implementation of measures that create an environment which is more attractive and more engaging for all genders. Thank you.
Alan and Astrid, thank you. That is a mighty, mighty piece of work that you have done there. Extremely thorough, a huge amount of work and very, very dense. But people will be able to go and peruse it in their leisure in case they can't remember all of those statistics off the top of their head. There was certainly a lot there. But what I took away from that in terms of the takeaways is if it matters, measure it is a pretty key takeaway for me. Let's now introduce Mary Wooldridge, who's CEO of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. Now, Mary joined WGEA after a very distinguished career in public, private and not-for-profit sectors back in 2021. She was, of course, in the Victorian Parliament as Minister for Mental Health, Community Services and Women's Affairs. Now, Mary leads the agency in driving gender equality in workplaces, ensuring that all women and men are equally represented, valued and rewarded. What a great job. Over to you, Mary.
Thanks very much, Madeleine, and thanks for your role in today's proceedings. I'd also like to take the opportunity to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land I'm coming from today, which is the Gadigal people. I also want to take the opportunity to just acknowledge and thank Alan, Astrid and the team for the work that they do. We have had a long-standing partnership with BCEC, great reports over 8 years on wide-ranging topics that really build the evidence base for gender equality. And I've got to say, when I travel overseas as well, people refer to this work because some of it is, most of it is nation-leading, some of it is world-leading as well. And it's a real reflection, Alan, on you and the team and the work that you do with the combination of WGEA's world-leading data set, but your insights and analytical capacity to really help move the dial in terms of gender equality. And it's great. Thanks to Bankwest for your work and Jodene, and really looking forward to the panel with Karen and Lisa to come. So the focus today is all about accelerating change, and for us at WGEA, this is core to our purpose because, as we've heard, change is happening, but it's slow, and we need to accelerate that change. And I think, as Alan touched on, the context and environment is like it's never been before. Gender equality is part of the national discussion. We've got a federal government developing a national gender equality strategy, the first, and engaging in a whole range of ways, including, importantly, wage rates for low-paid workers in particularly feminised industries. We've also got, with the legislative changes, new expectations on business in terms of increased transparency to help drive that change. And I think just more broadly in popular culture, issues like and things like the Matildas, Taylor Swift and amazing results, and even Barbie as a movie and its box office breakthroughs are all changing the debate and the conversation, informing a broader public about gender equality and why it's important. And for us at WGEA, we're really trying to position in terms of helping to accelerate the change is that we need to move from knowing better to doing better. We need to translate that knowledge and evidence base that we have into tangible actions on the ground that lead to more gender equal outcomes in the workforce. And, in all of these areas that Alan's been talking about today, we collect the data from employers, and there's a huge amount of work that happens to do that, and I want to acknowledge that. But they're areas that we know are important to gender equality. And what the maturity framework does is helps craft a pathway for action for employers. What are the next steps for them from where they're currently situated in terms of how they can move forward to progress action? And it also helps employers to understand where they're at in the context of their own industry. What are others doing that I should be doing, and where am I leading, and where do I need to continue to reinforce and do more? And in many ways, as we've seen, the recruitment and the retention policies and the broader policies have been an easier place to start. But what we've got to get to, we've got to continue there, of course, but what we've got to get to is the issues about pay and the differentials there, because really that is a harder conversation, but it's a reflection of value and how we value women and men in the workplace, and that needs to be fair and equal. And we see that in the results from the work and the report today. We have to work on all three fronts. We have to do the analysis. We have to get the results. These need to be sustained over time, and we need to be working in multiple ways. So from WGEA's perspective, there's a number of things I just quickly and briefly wanted to highlight. Firstly, we're going to continue to do the reporting, gender equality reporting, with thousands of employers right across Australia. And we are enhancing our offering in terms of tools, resources, support and advice to help employers to make the changes that need to happen. But as has been mentioned, there is now reporting of metrics to the board. These are the WGEA reports about your summary results, but also how you compare to your peer group. And we know that when these results are reported to the board, there's that engagement at the most senior levels that helps drive change. The second thing I just want to highlight is that from early 2024, larger companies with more than 500 employees are going to have policies and practices across the whole range of gender equality reporting. As we see once again from the report today, when you have comprehensive policies and when they're implemented, it makes a difference. And so that means workforce composition, board composition, equal pay, consultation with employees, flexible work and parental leave practices, and also safety and sexual harassment management and prevention. So this is an important area, once again, in the change that comes in with the reform. And the third area, which we think is very significant, is the fact that we will now have a significant focus on the gender pay gap, and we'll be publishing that for employers from early next year. And we'll also be publishing the gender composition by pay quartile, bringing a focus to that issue that Alan highlighted in relation to women's access to the highest levels of remuneration within an organisation, who is represented in the top earners in the organisations. And so what we need to see is the sum of all of those practices and all of those policies need to translate into practical outcomes that are reflected in the results of the gender pay gap as a proxy for gender equality and gender equal outcomes in the workplace. And we need to see those changes. We need to drive those changes. And what it will also do by being able to publish at an employer level is untangle what we see and what Alan highlighted, where industry averages can hide a very significant range for individual businesses that sit within that, and being able to look at those at an individual level and raise the accountability and raise the transparency in relation to it is really going to be very significant in terms of action and motivation for employers to drive the reduction of the gap. And of course, after year one, we'll also not only be able to see the absolute number and relative to industry, but also progress on that. What policies, practices and changes are being put in place, and how is that translating to improve gender pay gap over time for individual employers? So it's an exciting time. There's lots of change. It takes action to really translate these to tangible differences to accelerate the change, and that's certainly what we're looking for. And it's wonderful to be part of today's research, which of course helps to define that pathway, help companies think about how they can think about the next stages, their roadmap to making change, to reducing the gender pay gap and creating those gender equal workplaces. Thanks very much. Back to you, Madeleine.
Thanks very much for that, Maria. And to that point, you and Alan have talked about how you really want this to be a pathway for change and for there to be practical outcomes. To that very point, put your questions into the Q&A. If you have a really specific practical question, pop it in there and we'll get one of the panellists, Mary or Alan or our other two panellists, to try and answer that. You can be anonymous if you want to, but let's try and get as much practical outcome out of today as we can, as well as learning what the analysis and the numbers have told us today. So let's bring in the rest of our panel. So Lisa Samuels is our first panelist for today. Lisa is the Chief Experience Officer of HESTA, which is a $74 billion industry fund. It has 1 million members across Australia. Around 80% of those are women, and many of you will be familiar for a very long time with HESTA's work, and it's almost a byword for empowering women economically and getting them to reach their full economic potential. Karen Lonergan is our second panellist. She is the Chief People and Stakeholder Engagement Officer at Stockland. Stockland will also need very little introduction. It is one of Australia's largest residential developers. It also has a large retail footprint as well, and it has been an employer of choice for gender equality, I think, for 8 years running now, Karen, according to WGEA's policy. So it has done extremely well. Karen is a people and transformation leader with 25 years experience right across the gamut of a range of industries in Australia, Asia, the USA and Europe. We also have Mary on the panel, and we'll welcome back Alan Duncan, who authored today's report. So please do get your questions in. We're going to be publishing only 3 at a time. So if you don't see your question come up immediately in the chat box, don't worry, we will get to your question. Let me just start with you, Lisa, because HESTA, as I said, really has become a leader in this space, and it's almost a byword now for empowering women economically. When you see the results of today's insights, how does that relate back to the work that what you have been doing at HESTA? What lessons can you draw from what the data set today and the call to action is presenting?
Thanks, Madeleine. I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Kaurna people. And I think when we look at the report, there's a lot for us all to learn around how we can better think about this in a very broad context, because at HESTA, because of our members and the members that we serve, more than 800,000 women across Australia, we do think about this, and it is really in our DNA for many decades. And so we do think about it very broadly. So we think about it through 3 key lenses. We think about it internally. What are we doing internally at HESTA? And that includes also from a supply chain point of view. So we think about our partnership principles and our procurement process, and so when we're engaging partners, we are asking them questions about their gender diversity practices. We think about it as a large Australian investor. So recently we engage with all the many of the companies that we invest in. And recently we wrote to the top 300 ASX companies and asked them, and just made it clear that our focus was on gender equality as well. And finally, we think about it through the lens of a advocate on behalf of our members. And because of those members that we serve, and many of the women that we serve are in lower paid industries like aged care and early childhood education, we do feel like it's a really important role for us to be an advocate on behalf of our members.
I'll just ask the first question of you, Lisa, before I get to Karen, because a really simple question. What does the 40-40-20 represent? And that 40-40 vision has been a key driver for HESTA. Just explain what that is briefly.
Yeah, so 40-40 vision was initiated by HESTA, but there's many partners involved in this initiative, and it is focused on seeing more women in the ASX 300 at the executive level. And we're asking organisations to commit to targets and to report on their targets from a progress point of view. And while it is focused on executive roles in Australia's largest companies, I think what we're seeing is that this kind of focus is going more broadly to other parts of organisations as well. So it is about seeing 40% of executives as women, 40% men, and 20% all genders.
And Stockland achieved that a couple of years ago, Karen. It's been a real leader in this space, and in an industry which is not known for gender equality, in particular construction. But this has been at the forefront for you for a long time. What priorities does Stockland do? What practical steps has Stockland taken to achieve its role as an employer of choice for gender equality?
Thanks for the question, Madeleine, and great to be joining you from Gadigal land here today. Alan's report really sort of outlines in a much more cohesive way than I could ever do a whole lot of the things that that we've done over many years to get to the point we are today. If I can just sort of maybe pull out a couple of examples for people from some of the things that Alan mentioned, and then how we've interpreted that at Stockland. Firstly, it's, I remember years ago in a different industry, a CEO saying to me, "How hard can it be, Karen? Pay equity, surely, we can just do a salary review and fix it." Well, actually, it's a lot harder than you think, because there's so many different drivers, and Alan's report really brings that to life. So what we found you have to do is do a number of things really well over a number of years in order to get the right kind of sustainable results. So just a couple of examples of those moments that matter that you really have to be thoughtful about. One of them is recruitment. If you're not getting things right at the recruitment and selection stage, you're never going to have 40-40-20 or any other measure of equity within your organisation, and therefore you're never going to get pay equity. So when we're going out to market, particularly in areas that, as you said, Madeleine, our industry is not particularly well known, or historically hasn't been particularly well known for gender equity, I think we're actually doing really well these days, particularly when we're going out and looking at roles where it's hard to source female candidates. We don't take no for an answer. We don't just say, "Oh, it's difficult, so we'll just go with the usual list of candidates." We go the extra mile. We only work with search partners who are prepared to go the extra mile. We will not look at a short list that doesn't have credible women candidates on it. And sometimes we always go with the best candidate, and sometimes that's a male candidate. But when you really look hard, it's amazing how often you can find a really credible candidate. I think of a particularly tricky search we did recently, and people said it couldn't be done, so we went to a different search partner, and surprise, surprise, where did we get to? We hired a brilliant woman, not just someone who could do the role as well as some of the other candidates who may have been on the list, but an absolute rock star. So it's really putting the extra effort in at the recruitment front, and then really doing some process stuff in a very disciplined way. The report talks a lot about things like pay reviews and performance-based pay. We spend a lot of time at our annual remuneration review, and when we do our annual performance-based pay, really helping hold the mirror up to our leaders, really giving them lots of data, because I believe that data empowers leaders to make better decisions, to make sure that they're not inadvertently perpetuating any gender bias in their reviews and their allocation of performance-based pay. And really over the last couple of years now, we've been doing that for quite a long period of time. This year, we had virtually no instances where we needed to go back and say, "You know what, I think you need to have another look at this," because people have really got used to how you sort of make sure you don't bring any bias into that process.
So what you're talking about there, Karen, as you said from the outset, is a really systematic and long-term approach to it, with a clear thinking from the leadership that filters down. Mary, just for you, employer action is that key driver of change. We know that the pay gap stagnated actually for the first time at 22.8%. I assume that you were disappointed by that, but you know, how would you like to see on that particular metric progress be reignited?
Well, absolutely. So it was the first time that we hadn't had a reduction in the gender pay gap, and it was concerning. But I think, you know, I'm optimistic. I'm a glass half full sort of person, and I think that both the evidence base is expanding. I think the environment, as I touched on, and as Alan has touched on, you know, both sort of in a legislative context, but also in a national debate context, and engagement and awareness has increased. And we've got some particular levers, such as, you know, the upcoming publishing of gender pay gaps, are all combining, I think, for momentum to get back on track in relation to narrowing the gender pay gap, and in fact accelerating that rate of change. But what it does take is for employers to engage on that. And I think the tight labour market actually helps support that process, because people are, you know, competing for talent, competing for people, differentiating. Research is showing that people are making decisions in a much broader context than they have previously, including about values and environment and equality in terms of those decisions. And we know that there's, you know, many capable, skilled women who are underemployed or unemployed, who can be exceptional contributors to, you know, the work and the challenges in an employment context. So I think I'm optimistic about a re-engagement, a reduction, and that we can genuinely accelerate the change as we need to.
Alan.
Look, I completely agree with what Mary's mentioned, and, you know, just to develop that argument further, in context of some of the recent policy discussions that are underway, you know, we've clearly in Australia been facing sort of very tight market, as Mary has mentioned, and skill shortages in really important industry sectors. I don't think it has been enough recognised that some of the gendered segregations and the barriers to women's mobility across industry sectors and throughout and through the occupational progressions that they might aspire to. I don't think there's been enough appreciation about that as a contribution to the overall skill shortages that we face in Australia. And the more that we can break down barriers, the more that we can create a fluidity to allow people to meet their aspirations in terms of careers, I think the better will be the activity and the operation of Australia's labour market in meeting our future skills needs.
Alan, I just have one question for you, and then I'll get to some of the many questions that we're getting from the audience. For me, one of the most striking pieces of information in your report, when you look at levels of maturity, some of the lowest sectors, which are the lowest levels of maturity, are in the areas which have the highest proportion of women. So healthcare and social assistance, education and training, we're having huge skill shortages in those areas. They're female dominated, yet they have some of the most low performance levels in terms of your maturity framework. Why?
It's an interesting paradox, I have to say. Now, in some senses, some of those sectors where we see a far higher share of businesses at the growth or integrated level of maturity, where there's an advanced approach towards gender equity policies, they had quite a big distance to travel. Let's be honest. Some of the pay gaps were quite significant, and some of the inequities, between women and men within those industry sectors were large. You know, when we're looking, for example, at some of the construction or manufacturing or mining. Now, I think the response has been to implement and embed, a series of policies that are starting to make a difference, and you can see that in the data. I sometimes worry that female-dominated sectors may attract a degree of complacency when it comes to the implementation of policy. There's almost this sort of sense that, well, we're already relatively highly represented by women within our workforce, and so perhaps there's less impetus and there's less imperative to look deeply at the policies and strategies that are in play. And I think this report perhaps is a bit of a wake-up call to ensure that regardless of your sector, regardless of the balance of genders within your workforce, there is always work to be done to ensure that we eradicate as much as possible the biases that can creep in.
Thanks, Alan. Well, let's get to some of the questions, and I'll ask you as panelists to try and keep your answers short. So we do have a lot of questions, actually, so I'd like to get through as many as we can. Mary, there's a couple for you, and I'll put them together because you can deal with them fairly quickly. One is, Wajir, looking at including people who identify as non-binary into how you look at gender equity. The point being, as this poster says, today's workforce is not just male and female. And also, how does this maturity framework integrate with the current Wajir employer of choice for gender equality framework?
Okay, great questions, thanks, and I'll be as quick as I can. But so the review of our Act that recently happened that has led to these reforms has a number of outstanding areas that we've been working very actively on this year, which is including a broader definition of gender to be inclusive of non-binary, and also to look at capturing data in relation to other aspects of identity from a diversity perspective, so that we can do a more intersectional analysis. So we've done a lot of policy work on that. The recommendations are that from the review is that they get progressed. So we're optimistic, and we're working with the government in relation to embedding that. Although I've got to flag that people have been able to voluntarily report non-binary gender for their employees for 3 years now, and that data set is growing exponentially each and every year, which is fantastic, which will mean we'll be able to incorporate that more into the analysis. In terms of our employer of choice, so this analysis is all based on our regular reporting, and it has had to be because that's our big data set and the census that we do each and every year. The employer of choice builds on top of that, and we actually haven't yet done the matching, but we will do the exercise. But my expectation is that employers of choice are operating at either the highest or mostly the highest on all of these aspects of maturity, and in fact pushing that boundary for other things that are added on top of it. So the employer of choice, I suppose, sits on top of the maturity framework, which is more reflective of the broader census and the work that happens across the board.
Thanks, Mary. I've got a question which I think I'll direct to you, Lisa, because this will be within your purview. This is from Professor Jaya Dantas. She says, there's mention made about glass ceiling for women and migrant women especially, and while there's been change, what are strategies that organisations can employ to overcome these, specifically for migrant women leaders in the making? I know that there's a lot of focus at board level in particular. What about all through the employment structures?
One of the things that we've done recently at HESTA is we've done a broad diversity survey across all of our employees to really understand, much more about our employees outside of gender as well. So what was interesting about that survey is we had almost 40% of our employees that were born overseas. And so this is helping us to think about what's our next evolution of how do we think about our gender diversity, equity and inclusion practices going forward. And we do want to take a more intersectional approach and really designing and making sure we're designing for that broad diversity across our organisation. So that's something that we've practically been focused on recently.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's a work in progress for HESTA. What about for you at Stockland, Karen? Is this something that you're focused on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this whole question of intersectionality is really important to look at, and we're trying to get better at integrating the different sort of streams of diversity that we look at, so that we're sort of solving, you know, we're trying to solve a number of challenges at once. For the audience, if you haven't had a look at it, I really encourage you to read the recent report that Chief Executive Women did in partnership with Macquarie Group. Really, really great piece of research on the sort of the intersection of gender and cultural diversity. It's got some really interesting case studies in there that people might want to have a look at.
Mary, a question for you, I think, which is actually mirrors a couple of questions we've had in about targets. This one specifically about pay equity targets. Realistically, how much improvement can be made in a particular year? So if, you know, especially if companies or organisations are integrated, if the best organisations are averaging 5% over 3 years, is that something to aim for, or is that unrealistic?
I think it is absolutely something to aim for, and what Alan's research showed over the years is that setting targets work as a driver of change and as something that focuses the mind. But I think it does give us some boundaries about expectations in terms of this work today as well. Is, you know, there's not a silver bullet. This is not you put 3 things in place and the numbers are going to change dramatically. This is long-term, sustained, over time expectation. So our best performers in this report are just over 5% over 3 years. So thinking about that change of, you know, getting to 1% or even a little bit more is a great outcome. So, you know, target setting can be long-term as well. You know, you see some changes that have been made, and I often, you know, think about BHP and what they've done on their workforce composition. That was a 15-year target. And, you know, and it does take time because, of course, the gender pay gap is not just fixing pay differentials. Its composition is fundamentally underpins what's happening here. And, you know, that's not just we've got to recruit more women. It's actually changing the culture and the environment, putting those policies and practices in place so that, you know, everyone can thrive and succeed in the environment and not only, you know, get recruited, but are retained, progress and succeed. So I think we, you know, have to be realistic that this is long-term change, and this is an investment that needs to be, you know, have vigilance in terms of each and every year and in terms of the policies and practices.
It's good that you brought up BHP there, because we have another question from Runa who says, what's led to the mining industry being one of the most progressive in terms of gender equality, in terms of actually moving the dial? Mary, I might go for you first, and then Alan, perhaps you've got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think they have made some very concerted efforts. So they're one of the they're one of the highest in terms of composition of men versus women. I think from memory it's about 20% women, 80% men. But the mining industry is actually at about a 14% gender pay gap, and that's against an average of 22.8. So you know, they've actually done significant work recognising that there is that competition for talent, that they actually have to shift. There's obviously some ongoing safety issues that they're very overtly sort of both been highlighted but working to change. And I think it's a reflection of an industry that's recognised. But I think, you know, I'm sure as Alan will say, there's mixed responses. Some companies have worked very hard and proactively and are making inroads, and some aren't, because those industry averages mask the individuals within it.
Yeah, Alan, well, do you want to start? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. As Mary mentioned, there's been good progress within the for businesses within the mining sector. There has needed to be, because there was a greater distance to travel, as I mentioned, in mining as a sector, alongside one or two other sectors. So we have seen, you know, greater progress. A lot of the focus, you know, has, I think, transitioned from success in narrowing gender pay gaps within occupational tiers and strata to now trying to equalise the balance of men and women across you know, tiers of the organisation. So the composition story is a really important one, and to that I think you see commitment from the most advanced businesses in the mining sector around work design settings, around working conditions, around safety, around respect at work, around sort of flexibility to the degree that is possible, depending upon the the roles that men and women can undertake. So I do think we've seen action out of necessity, but we're seeing the returns to those actions at the moment.
A question for you, Lisa, which is a really key one, I think. Are you able to share the impact of your 40/40 initiative and how, beyond just setting a target, HESTA has helped organisations to get there? You talked about your suppliers a little bit earlier, and obviously you're pushing for those ASX 300. What practical things have you helped do there?
I think it's important to recognise that companies want to engage in this because better diversity and inclusion practices drive better business performance. Diversity of thought, better decision making, more creativity, and ultimately better business performance. So some of Australia's largest companies are part of 40/40 Vision. Companies like BHP, ANZ, Westpac, a number of very large companies, about 25% of the market capitalisation of the ASX 300. So all of their data is published as well. So we can see how the organisations are tracking over time, and we can see positive improvements as well. And I think that's the whole point of WGEA making this data public next year, is to drive faster pace of change. It's very slow right now.
Yeah, and that comes as well to a question that someone has posted saying, do you think gender auditing causes better outcomes, or are better performing organisations just more likely to undertake the auditing to showcase their gender credentials? Well, when it's voluntary, maybe, but that's not going to be the option for much longer. Is that right, Mary?
Well, I think we'll be publishing gender pay gaps. Companies don't have to do the gender pay gap analysis in order to do it. We see, just over half of all companies do a pay gap analysis sometime in the last 4 or 5 years, but once again, from Alan's maturity framework, those who are doing it in the last year at a high, and do it on an annual basis, because you do have to keep that analysis going, are at a higher level of maturity than those who don't. What we've seen, though, that's been fascinating is that even of those who do an analysis, almost, about half don't take any action as a result. It affirms the biases that they have. Oh, of course we, have more women in clerical roles that are lower paid. That's the nature of it, or whatever the outcomes might be. So, they do the analysis, but are not then translating that to action. And this is where it's important that, the gender pay gap is not just about the like-for-like pay, which of course is the law, but it actually really reflects that composition and the differences in occupations and positions that drive higher and lower wages. And so we believe that the publishing of gender pay gaps, and companies actually will have an opportunity to put a link to a document alongside their gender pay gap, which is a narrative, and they'll be able to say, we've done the analysis, these are the issues that we identified, and here's what we're going to do. We think there'll be a generosity that says, okay, we want to know that companies are genuine in addressing this from wherever they're starting in the journey, and that's going to, I think, be the challenge for companies going forward.
Yeah, well, what you've just touched on there is exactly touches on a question from Kate, who's from Eve and Adam Advisory. And I'll put this question to you, I think, Karen, because Kate says, we work with clients who genuinely want to reduce their gender pay gap. They've done very well at higher levels of their organisations, but they struggle to do it at lower levels where women dominate in admin roles and are paid market or above market rates. But the number of women makes for that permanent pay gap. Is that a bad thing? Kate asks, what would you recommend in that circumstance?
Yeah, so I think Kate's question flags a really important distinction here. It's not really getting in and doing a proper gender pay analysis is a hard piece of work to do. And I think if you can really get in and look at it from lots of different lenses, you can make your own decision on whether or not it's a bad thing or not, because it's probably a bit situational depending on a particular organisation. But I think one of the things that I often feel a bit disappointed about is you see some companies talking a lot about, oh, we've closed the gender pay gap, but actually all they've done, as Mary says, is ensure that they're complying with legislation and not discriminating on a like-for-like basis. You've got to get under the hood and do the hard yards and do an analysis that gets you beyond that, and then you can make a decision in your own organisation about, have we got a problem at the admin level, or have we got a, you know, like BHP recognising that you are wasting talent by not opening up truck driving jobs to women. So I think it's just about doing it properly, and that's one of the trade-offs between, you know, we all accept that we all see the pace as being glacial for change, but actually what we don't also want to do is get people finding quick solutions that aren't really solutions at all. So just make you think you're doing okay.
Would you accept that at Stockland, for example, just to put you on the spot, if, you know, there were more women in lower paid admin roles, therefore that pay gap was not narrowing to the extent that it has at executive levels? Is that okay?
I think it, and I will absolutely answer the question, but I think it depends, because I think what you then do when we find something like that, when we do our analysis and we do find pools like that, then we get under the hood to find out why. Is there sort of some systemic bias that means that we're only hiring women or men for a particular category of employment, or is there a way that we're thinking about that job that means we're not paying it at the right level? So you've got to get under the hood and then find out what the problem driver is, and that may mean it just, for the moment, it is a role that you do have more women than men. What are you doing about it over the longer term? Or you might realise you've got something that you need to change right now because it's not working.
And Alan, when it comes to things like paid parental leave, sharing of that, how much, according to the framework, that's a really key point. Do you expect that once that is more evenly distributed, which is taking a very long time, and those cultural change has happened about what is acceptable work for women and what is acceptable for men, do you expect to see a dial shift then?
Look, I'd like to think so. As I mentioned, I think when we sort of closed the presentation, businesses have I think an important role to play in addressing societal norms around, you know, what are accessible or aspirational careers for women and men, and the environment in which women and men can work within businesses or across industry sectors is really critical to that. The important thing is to create the greatest opportunity for women and men to aspire and reach their goals in whatever careers that they may seek, rather than have to confront barriers that are different and more significant and more severe for women and men. It's the fact that we have these barriers in place that I think have created a lot of the concentrations that we see. So to the extent that we're able to remove those barriers through the sorts of policies around, you know, flexible work, around you know, working from home, around parental leave, I think these are important contributions to a general societal change.
And that goes to a question that someone's asked as well about the impact that working from home has had on gender equality, given the time frame during which you actually did the assessment and you've been looking at here, the work. Do you think that lockdowns, increased work from home, women working in areas where, let's say, healthcare and education, where they weren't necessarily able to work from home, that has impacted the results in this year's report?
Look, I'd be really keen to hear others' reflections from their perspective, but you know, I think it can't have done anything other than shifted perspectives of a lot of businesses on the viability and and the potential for working from home to feature more prominently in working arrangements. My sense was that COVID was an unfortunate experiment forced on a lot of businesses, but I think it revealed that flexibility in working arrangements was perhaps more possible than maybe businesses had felt before the onset of the COVID pandemic. The world, the sky didn't fall in, productivity didn't plummet through the floor. In actual fact, I suspect that the engagement of workers in businesses, perhaps has improved as a consequence of the experience of working from home. So that's my perspective, but it'd be great to hear the perspective of others.
Did anyone else want to jump in on that one? Yes, go for it, please, Karen.
Thanks. I think what I would add is not so much looking back at what happened in COVID, but looking forward as hybrid work has really become entrenched now for white collar workers. Is we and I know other employers are the same, trying to be really careful that we don't end up with gendered outcomes, making sure that the way that we're thinking about hybrid work doesn't have unintended gender consequences. The classic would be you end up with a situation where it's only those sort of feminised kind of roles that we've already been talking about today that have access to that, and therefore if you choose to work in a hybrid way, you're taking yourself out of the out of promotion opportunities. We've been quite thoughtful about how to make sure that we don't have those kind of unintended impacts, and I think over the next couple of years, as we really get back to a new normal in Australian business, that's going to be something that, and I suspect Mary's all over it, that's going to be something that we're going to have to keep our eyes on.
Lisa?
Yeah, I think it has levelled the playing field in some respects. Depends on the industry that you work in. Obviously, if you're a frontline worker, you don't have a choice about working in a hybrid way. But we do at HESTA, and now everyone works in a hybrid way, which maybe before COVID, there was only some people, maybe more women, that were working in a hybrid way. So it's, hopefully we get to the point sometime in the future where unpaid work is shared equally. That would be an amazing outcome.
And then the other point I want to make as well, and I agree with what everyone said, but also that we have to make sure that flexibility and working from home are not synonymous. Flexibility is so much broader than that. And I think Alan's points about part-time work at the managerial level, which we see as absolutely fundamental to that job redesign, unlocking opportunities for women to work at the most senior levels if they're balancing other, competing caring and family responsibilities. We have to think about flexibility broadly in the context of part-time work, job share, reduced hours, whatever, compressed weeks, whatever it might be, and that working from home is important. But it's not the only answer to this, and it's fundamental that we challenge that design aspect of those most senior positions to enable women to be able to access them.
I think 4-day weeks all round is what we probably need to make us all happy. That'll be the solution. Hey, Mary, I'm going to throw you the curliest question. I'm going to ask you to answer it in 30 seconds to answer, but it's a really good one. This is to end. Are you seeing an impact on gender pay gap with the rise of AI, a technical advancement that's going to automate clerical and administrative roles, which are more female dominated? What do you think?
We haven't seen it yet in terms of our numbers, but it's fascinating. And I don't think, I think it's actually across the whole workforce. I think there's some broader issues in relation to women engaging in the AI industry and having the opportunities of that growth market as well. So I think it's a watch this space.
Yes, we're all watching very closely, aren't we? Look, it's 3:18 and I don't want to run over time because it's been fantastic to have everyone's attention for so long for such an important piece of work. I just want to thank all of you, Alan, Lisa, Karen and Mary. This is a really great piece of work, and I'd also just like to really acknowledge what you touched on, Mary, in your introduction, which is actually a lot of this is world leading. It's really fantastic in Australia that we have an agency set up to monitor in this way, that we look at the data in such a systemic and way, and that we have a commitment from governments at lots of levels now to try and really improve that and to improve female economic empowerment, because as we were talking about at the outset, it's unacceptable that the largest group, the fastest rising group of people who are becoming homeless in this country is women over the age of 55. It's just wrong. So getting this stuff right from the get-go benefits all of us. It benefits women, it benefits men, it benefits people who identify as non-binary as well. And it's a great piece of work. And I'd like to point everyone to where they can download the report. It's at bcec.edu.au if you would like to dig more into the details. Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them, but there were some really good ones there. But please do dig further into the report, and thank you very much for all of your attention today, all your questions, and thanks again to the panel for what was a really great discussion and a really great piece of work, the Gender Equity Insights for 2023. Have a great afternoon.